Welcome to Unadulterated Adultery Confessions. It all started on a warm summer morning in Seattle. The air was sticky with heat, and I could feel my scarf clinging to my neck as I stood outside the modest brick house. This was my first job in America, far from the dusty streets of Marrakesh where I grew up. Back home, I'd never imagined leaving my family or my small world. But life had a way of surprising us. The Reynolds, a seemingly perfect family of four, needed a nanny, and I needed the money. It wasn't just about the paycheck. It was about proving to my parents and siblings that I could do this, that I could thrive in a country so different from my own. I was 29, unmarried, and fiercely independent, a rarity for a Moroccan woman. Lena Reynolds, the wife, was polished and stunning. She wore tailored blouses and designer heels that clacked against the marble floors of their spacious home. She welcomed me with a warm smile, her blonde hair swept into a bun, and spoke in that deliberate way Americans do, as though they wanted you to know every single word mattered. Then there was Ethan Reynolds, the husband. He was tall, with an easy charm that immediately put you at ease. His sandy brown hair curled slightly at the ends, and his laugh lines hinted at a man who had seen joy, not just stress. He didn't say much that day, just nodded politely and handed me a cup of tea. Their children, Sophie and Elias, were 5 and 3, full of energy and endless questions. I was nervous, of course. I'd never worked as a nanny before, but Lena assured me that my experience as the eldest of 6 siblings would suffice. She was kind, but I could tell she was a perfectionist. She handed me a thick binder of rules, meal plans, daily routines, emergency numbers, and even instructions for folding laundry. The first few weeks were uneventful. I'd wake up at 6 a.m., prepare breakfast, pack Sophie's lunch for school, and keep Elias entertained until nap time. My days were filled with storybooks, finger painting, and chasing Elias around the backyard. At night, I'd retreat to my small room in the basement, exhausted but content. It wasn't until one afternoon, about a month into the job, that I noticed Ethan watching me. I was sitting on the kitchen floor, wiping up a spill Elias had made with his juice box, when I felt his eyes on me. "You're amazing with them," he said, leaning against the counter. I looked up, startled. "Oh, thank you, sir. Please call me Ethan," he said, smiling. I felt the heat rise to my cheeks. It wasn't what he said, but the way he said it, like he truly meant it. Back home, men rarely spoke to women with such kindness unless there was an ulterior motive. But Ethan seemed different. From that day, I began noticing him more. How he always asked if I'd had lunch, how he offered to help carry the groceries, and how he lingered in the kitchen when I cooked. Lena, on the other hand, was often absent, busy with her high-powered corporate job. "Don't you ever get tired?" Ethan asked one evening as I was setting the dining table. "Tired of what?" "Of doing everything for everyone." I shrugged. "It's my job. I'm used to it." "You shouldn't have to be," he said, his soft voice lingering in my mind long after he left the room. It was strange being seen like that. In my culture, women were expected to give endlessly, to serve without question. But Ethan's words made me feel appreciated. I tried to ignore it, of course. I reminded myself of who I was and what I believed in. I was a Muslim woman, bound by faith and tradition. There were lines I could never cross, no matter how kind or handsome my employer was. But life, as I would soon learn, had other plans. That summer stretched endlessly, the days long and hot. Lena's work trips became more frequent, leaving Ethan and me alone with the children. Slowly, the boundaries began to blur. At first, it was innocent, shared jokes, stolen glances, and casual conversations that lasted a little too long. But deep down, I knew I was treading dangerous waters. I often thought of my mother's voice, stern and unwavering. "Amina, remember who you are. This world will tempt you, but you must stay true to yourself." I had always prided myself on my self-control, my ability to resist the temptations of the modern world. But Ethan was different. It was a rainy evening when things shifted. The children were asleep, the house quiet except for the sound of rain tapping against the windows. I was in the kitchen, cleaning up after dinner, when Ethan walked in. "Need some help?" he asked, rolling up his sleeves. "No, it's okay. I'm almost done," I replied, but he stayed anyway. We worked in silence for a while, the air heavy with unspoken words. Finally, he broke the silence. "Do you ever miss home?" "Every day," I admitted. But I came here for a reason. You've sacrificed so much, he said, his voice tinged with admiration. I looked at him surprised. Why do you say that? Because I see it, the way you put everyone else first, the way you never complain. It's rare. His words caught me off guard. No one had ever spoken to me like that before, not even back home. I felt a strange mix of gratitude and guilt, as though I was betraying something sacred just by listening. It's nothing special, I said, brushing off the compliment. It is to me, he replied, his gaze locking with mine. And in that moment something shifted between us. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. A connection, a spark, a silent acknowledgement of something neither of us dared to name. I went to bed that night with a heavy heart, torn between my faith and the growing feelings I couldn't ignore. I prayed for strength, for clarity, for the courage to stay on the right path. But deep down, I knew my world was about to change in ways I could never have imagined, and that I was complicated and flawed and bound by rules he could never understand, but instead I said nothing. The days passed in a blur. I tried to convince myself that nothing had changed, but deep down I knew it had. Ethan's presence was everywhere. His laughter echoed through the house, his scent lingered in the air, and his voice replayed in my mind long after he was gone. I began to notice the little things about him, the way his eyes wrinkled when he smiled, the way he hummed under his breath while doing dishes, the way he always made sure the kids said thank you and please. He wasn't just kind. He was thoughtful in a way that felt rare and precious. One afternoon, as I was pushing Sophie on the swing in the backyard, Ethan came out with a tray of iced tea. Thought you might need a break, he said, handing me a glass. Thank you, I said, taking it gratefully. We sat on the porch steps watching the children play. Do you ever think about what your life could have been? He asked suddenly. I looked at him surprised. What do you mean? I mean if you'd stayed in Marrakesh, if you hadn't come here. All the time, I admitted. But I came here for a reason. And have you found it? He asked, his gaze steady. I hesitated, unsure of how to answer. In some ways, yes. But in others, it's complicated. He hesitated as though he understood. Life has a way of surprising you, doesn't it? It does, I agreed, my voice barely above a whisper. For a moment we sat there in silence, the air between us thick with unspoken words. I wanted to tell him how much his kindness meant to me, how his presence had become a comfort in a world that often felt lonely and foreign. But I couldn't. I wouldn't. That night I lay awake in my room staring at the ceiling. I thought of my family back home, of my mother's prayers and my father's stern warnings. Stay true to your faith, they had always said. Never forget who you are. I wanted to believe I was still that girl, the one who prayed 5 times a day and wore her scarf with pride. But the truth was I was changing and it disenchanted me. The next morning I avoided Ethan as much as I could. I busied myself with chores, keeping my head down and my mind focused. But by the afternoon, it was impossible to avoid him. He found me in the laundry room, sorting through a pile of clothes. Amina, he said, his voice soft. I didn't look up. Yes. Are you okay? I'm fine, I said quickly. But he didn't believe me. Please don't shut me out, he said, stepping closer. I know I crossed the line. It's not about you, I interrupted, finally looking at him. It's about me. My beliefs. My faith. I understand, he said, but the look in his eyes told me he didn't. How could he? I can't, I began, but the words caught in my throat. I can't do this. He nodded slowly, his expression filled with regret. I'm sorry, Amina. I never wanted to make you uncomfortable. You didn't, I said quickly. That's the problem. For a moment we just stood there, the silence between us saying all the things we couldn't. I'll give you space, he said finally. Thank you. I whispered, my voice trembling. As he left the room, I felt a wave of relief mixed with an ache I couldn't quite name. I knew I was doing the right thing, but it didn't make it any easier. That night I struggled harder than I ever had before. I prayed for strength, for guidance, for the courage to stay true to myself. And as I knelt on the floor, tears streaming down my face, I realized something. I wasn't just fighting temptation. I was fighting a part of myself I didn't recognize. The days after our conversation in the laundry room were tense. But, absent-mindedly, Ethan kept his promise to give me space, and I did everything I could to refocus on my job. I threw myself into taking care of Sophie and Elias, planning crafts and baking projects that kept us all busy from morning till bedtime. But even as I kept my hands occupied, my mind wandered to him. Ethan stayed cordial, almost distant, and I convinced myself that this was the best way forward. We could pretend nothing had happened, that the words we'd shared in the laundry room were just a moment of weakness. For a while it almost worked. Then came the storm. It was a Friday evening just after sunset when the rain began. The thunder rolled in first, shaking the windows and startling Elias, who clung to my leg as I cleaned up the dinner table. "Don't worry, Elias," I said, scooping him up. "It's just a little noise. Let me get you ready for bed." "Okay?" "Okay." I carried him upstairs, reading his favorite bedtime story while the rain poured outside. By the time both kids were asleep, the storm had grown stronger. The wind howled, and the house felt eerily quiet despite the chaos outside. I headed downstairs, expecting to find Ethan in his usual spot on the couch. Instead, I found him in the kitchen, staring out the window with a glass of wine in his hand. His shirt sleeves were rolled up, and the soft glow of the kitchen light highlighted the sharp lines of his jaw. He looked deep in thought, and I hesitated in the doorway, unsure if I should interrupt. "You don't drink wine, do you?" he asked without turning around, as if sensing my presence. "No," I replied, stepping into the room. "It's against my faith." He nodded, finally turning to face me. "I figured as much. You're different. Is that a bad thing?" I asked, a small smile tugging at my lips. "Not at all," he said, his voice soft. "It's refreshing." I busied myself by wiping down the counters, trying to ignore the way his words made my heart race. The tension in the room was palpable, and I could feel his eyes on me as I worked. "Amina," he said after a long silence. "Yes," I replied, not looking up. "Can we talk?" I stopped wiping and turned to face him. "About what?" "About us," he said, his voice low. I shook my head, my pulse quickening. "There is no us, Ethan." "Then why can't I stop thinking about you?" he asked, stepping closer. "Ethan, please," I began, but he interrupted me. "I know it's wrong," he said, his voice trembling. "I know I shouldn't feel this way, but I can't help it. I see you every day taking care of the kids, making this house feel like a home. And he stopped, running a hand through his hair. "I've never met anyone like you." My breath caught in my throat. His words were everything I had tried to ignore, everything I told myself I didn't want to hear. But hearing them now, spoken aloud, made it impossible to deny what was happening between us. "Ethan," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "you're married. You have a family." "I know," he said, his eyes filled with pain. "But Lena is always gone, always busy. And when she's here it's like we're strangers. You're the only one who makes me feel." He stopped again, as if the words were too difficult to say. I stood frozen, torn between the part of me that knew this was wrong, and the part of me that longed to feel wanted, cherished, and seen. "Amina," I whispered, but it wasn't a plea for him to stop. It was something else entirely. A surrender. He closed the distance between us, his lips capturing mine in a kiss that was gentle at first, then deepened as we gave in to the emotions we'd both been fighting for so long. Hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that he couldn't love me, that what we were doing was nothing more than a mistake. But I couldn't, because deep down I knew I felt the same way. He reached for my hand, his fingers intertwining with mine. Amina looked at me reluctantly. I lifted my eyes to meet his. The intensity in his gaze made my breath catch in my throat. "You mean everything to me," Ethan said. "I know this isn't right, but I can't imagine my life without you." The tears I'd been holding back finally spilled over. He pulled me into his arms, holding me tightly as I cried. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I never meant for this to happen." "Neither did I," he said softly. "But I don't regret it." As the weeks turned into months, our affair became harder to hide. Lena's absences gave us the freedom to indulge in our forbidden relationship, but the moments when she was home were unbearable. I avoided her as much as I could, ashamed to look her in the eyes. She was kind to me, trusting, and utterly unaware of the betrayal unfolding under her roof. Amina, you've been such a blessing to this family, she said one evening as we sat in the kitchen. I don't know how we managed before you came along. Her words felt like a knife to my chest, and I forced a smile. Thank you, Mrs. Reynolds. Please call me Lena, she said, laughing lightly. You're practically part of the family. Her trust only deepened my guilt, but it didn't stop me. Each night after Lena went to bed, Ethan would find me. Sometimes we talked. Other times we'd simply hold each other, lost in the silence of the house. More often than not, we'd end up tangled in his bed, lost in a passion that made me forget everything else. One night, after Lena had left for a weekend conference, Ethan and I shared a bottle of wine in the living room. I hadn't meant to drink, but he insisted, pouring me a small glass and teasing me until I took a sip. The warmth of the wine spread through me, loosening the tight grip of my self-control. You're beautiful, he said, his voice slow and husky. Do you know that? I shook my head, feeling my cheeks flush. You're just saying that. I'm not, he said, leaning in. You're the most beautiful woman I've ever seen. Before I could respond, he kissed me, his lips capturing mine in a way that left no room for doubt. This wasn't just lust. It was something deeper, something neither of us could name. His hands moved to my waist, pulling me closer, and I felt myself surrender completely. We didn't make it to the bedroom that night. Instead, we stayed there on the living room floor, the flickering light of the fireplace casting shadows on the walls as we lost ourselves in each other. It was raw, unrestrained, and completely consuming. The next morning, I woke up in his arms, the events of the night before replaying in my mind. I should have felt embarrassed, but all I felt was a strange sense of contentment. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I belonged. As I got dressed and prepared breakfast for the children, Ethan came into the kitchen, his expression soft. Good morning, he said, kissing my forehead. Morning, I murmured, trying to keep my voice steady. We should talk, he said, his tone serious now. I nodded, knowing he was right. We couldn't keep pretending this wasn't happening. We couldn't keep living in this fantasy world we'd created. But even as I agreed, a part of me wasn't ready to let go. The days after that night in the living room passed in a haze. Ethan and I became more reckless, consumed by the fire we'd ignited. Each moment alone with him felt like a stolen treasure, a secret I both cherished and feared. Yet, the more time we spent together, the heavier the guilt became. Lena returned from her conference the following Monday. She was present in the house, a stark reminder of the life Ethan and I were dismantling piece by piece. She was warm and cheerful as ever, unaware of the betrayal playing out behind her back. Watching her interact with the children, I felt a deep sense of shame. She didn't deserve this. None of them did. One evening, after Lena had gone to bed, I sat on the porch steps, staring out at the darkened sky. The air was crisp, the stars scattered like tiny shards of glass. I wrapped my scarf tighter around my shoulders, trying to block out the chill, and the thoughts swirling in my mind. Ethan joined me moments later, his footsteps soft against the wooden floor. He sat down beside me, close enough that our shoulders brushed. You've been quiet, he said, his voice low. I've been thinking, I replied, not looking at him. About us. I nodded, my throat tightening. Ethan, we can't keep doing this. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. I know. It's complicated. It's not just complicated. I interrupted, my voice trembling. It's wrong. You have a wife, a family, and I've lost myself in this. I don't even recognize who I am anymore. He reached for my hand, his touch gentle. You're still you, Amina. You're the woman who loves my kids like they're her own. The woman who's brought life back into this house. Don't let this ruin everything. I pulled my hand away, tears stinging my eyes. But it has, Ethan. Don't you see? We've ruined everything. For the first time, his composure cracked. I love you, Amina, he said, his voice breaking. I can't lose you. His words cut through me like a knife. I loved him too, there was no denying that anymore. But love wasn't enough to erase the damage we'd done. I love you too, I whispered, the admission tumbling out before I could stop it. But it's destroying me. The following week, I made a decision. I knew I couldn't stay. Not like this. The weight of what we'd done was too much to bear. and I couldn't continue living in a house built on lies. I began searching for a new job in secret, reaching out to agencies and families in need of a nanny. It wasn't easy. I'd grown attached to Sophie and Elias, and the thought of leaving them broke my heart. But I knew it was the only way to save myself. One evening, as I was tucking Sophie into bed, she looked up at me with her wide blue eyes and asked, "Amina, are you leaving?" Her question startled me. "Why would you think that, sweetheart?" "Because you've been sad," she said simply. "And Daddy says people leave when they're sad." I forced a smile, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I'm not going anywhere right now, Sophie. Go to sleep, okay?" She nodded, closing her eyes. But as I left the room, her words lingered in my mind. People leave when they're sad. She was right. I was leaving because I couldn't stay in a place that had become a prison of my own making. 2 weeks later, I handed in my resignation.